Hello everyone, and welcome to this RECONNECT panel discussion on COVID-19 states of emergency, response, reform, and recovery. I'm Alexander Nemolen from the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies at KU Leuven, and I will be your moderator today. As I'm sure many of you know, this is the second panel we are hosting on the COVID-19 crisis, both because in itself it is a serious and multifaceted challenge that demands our attention, of course, but also because it is an interesting lens through which to consider wider questions. And this is what we will try to do today, broadening our horizons with our wonderful panel and highlighting how there are several issues and challenges that in many ways are very much related to each other. We will start with Joelle Grogan from Middlesex University, who will give us a bird's eye view on the rule of law fallout in the context of the current crisis, based on the Verfassungsblog Symposium on this topic that she developed and hosted. Paul Blokker from the University of Bologna instead will focus particularly on how populist parties have reacted to current circumstances. And then Cassandra Emmons from Princeton University will instead reflect on the balance between dealing with the challenges of a public health emergency and the protection of international human rights. Finally, Andrea Sangiovanni, currently at the European University Institute, will discuss the scheme for unemployment reinsurance, known as SURE, which has been triggered at the beginning of April of this year within the European Union as a result of the economic fallout of COVID-19, which brings into focus the role of the EU as a guarantor of solidarity among the member states. As always, we very much look forward to your questions, which you can send to me via the webinar chat box, which you can find in the control panel. And now it's my great pleasure to give the floor to our first speaker and a colleague in the context of the RECONNECT project, Joelle Grogan. So you have the floor.
Hello and welcome to this webinar. I hope everyone can hear me quite well wherever you are in the world. So what I'm going to do, just as this introductory part of the webinar, is to give, exactly as Alex said, a bird's eye view of the kind of regulatory responses that we've seen to COVID-19 right across the EU. So I will be focusing on the legal nature of the measures taken in response. So what I'm actually going to be talking about first is one of the critical issues that we've seen from an EU perspective, which is the nationalism of response. This isn't unique to the EU, this is right across the world. We've seen primarily a country or state-based response only. There's been limited intervention from any international or transnational organizations. So just to give you a skipping view of what I'm going to talk about. First, I'm going to talk about the difference between states of emergency that we've seen declared, and also the reliance on ordinary legislation instead of states of emergency in EU countries. I'll then talk about one of the critical concerns that it does not matter if you've declared a state of emergency or relied solely on ordinary legislation, which is the use or potential abuse of executive power, and the kind of conditions and limitations that we're seeing on it, or in some cases, very concerningly in the EU context, that we're not seeing at all. I'm then going to talk about trends. We're seeing two emerging trends, again within the EU and right across the world. The first kind of trend is approaches based on trust and transparency of government regulation and action. And the second, which is more concerning, based on surveillance and sanction, quite severe sanctioning mechanisms, which also can quite strongly correlate with the militarism of response. The final thing I'm going to talk about, which I think is critical as we move forward, and especially in the context of my other fantastic panelists, reform. What lessons have we learned? What lessons should we take on? And when we consider the reform of regulation, the reform of laws, even the reform of constitutions, and critically, what the EU should be doing, what lessons do we need to know? So first, in the context of states of emergency. Now, a state of emergency is a special situation which critically allows the more urgent use of power, typically by the executive. Now, we've seen just under half of the states in the EU declare a state of emergency. But one thing that I need to initially highlight is that worldwide, we've seen restrictions placed on individual liberty, movement, assembly, worship, education, commercial activity, but beyond that, on courts, parliaments, and elections, on a scale and a scope that is unique in contemporary history. We haven't seen this before. Now, the division between those states who have declared a state of emergency and those who have relied solely on ordinary legislation has, and to me this is the most interesting part of what I've so far seen, it's not been any more or any less determinative of an abuse. We're seeing the same kind of restrictions everywhere, but we're seeing the same kind of legal and democratic hazards based on whether or not states have declared a state of emergency and engaged with that kind of laws and regulations versus those who've relied solely on ordinary legislation. So to focus initially on state of emergency, these are typically unique to every constitution in the EU. We see some constitutions which place heavy requirements of oversight, of parliamentary oversight, on when a state of emergency can be declared and when it can't be declared, and also the kind of conditions or limitations. Now, the reason this is important, especially within the context of COVID-19, is the degree of restriction that I've just mentioned. Of the 11 or so states in the EU who have declared a state of emergency under their constitution, very few of them have actually, again, under legal requirements, engaged with rights debates. And by that I mean, and Cassie will be talking about this, derogations and engaging with international rights instruments. Very few have done that. I think 3 on my initial count this morning. The reason that a lot of people across the world are so concerned about states of emergency is negative historical experience. In a state of emergency, power is concentrated. The urgency of response that is needed means power is concentrated in the executive, and often it can be used for an unjustifiable reason to bring in government policy as opposed to urgent response to the crisis. For this reason, and many states have been very wary or concerned about engaging with a state of emergency. Or in some other cases, the Constitution simply doesn't allow a state of emergency to be called in the context of a COVID-19 crisis. For example, in Ireland, the restriction is to a time of war or armed rebellion. Now, despite the fact that we've seen many countries throughout the world saying that they are declaring war on COVID-19, it's hardly arguable that a health crisis could constitute a war in the meaning of that constitution. So we've seen a lot of states, in fact, the majority of states, relying on ordinary legislation, typically on health acts. Now, the concern about relying on health acts only is most of them are not fit for purpose in a global health crisis or a pandemic. A lot of the health acts that we've been looking at are very outdated, even by contemporary standards. Ireland's Act is from 1947, Austria was from 1950. All of these acts, in fact, in nearly every country that we reported on, which is all EU countries, there have been urgent reforms to the law, urgent amendments made to the law. The concern when you do law quickly, just like I'm often warned by the head of our faculty, urgent academia or fast academia is bad academia. When you try and reform law very, very quickly, for example, in under 12 hours in Denmark, you can create legal hazards. You can create uncertainty. You can create regulatory chaos. We've seen legal and regulatory chaos almost throughout the EU in terms of the initial responses. But as I'm going to finish off with, the distinguishing factor is always reform, how you have reformed the law. Critically, between states of emergency or relying solely on ordinary legislation, the danger that we're considering, the danger that we're always worried about, is abuse of executive power. Now, very concerningly, in the context of the EU, we've seen this, we've absolutely seen this. And this is the Hungarian case that we've been talking about for many weeks. But one of the other interesting things I do want to highlight is how many states have also been in the middle of almost a political crisis, well, not a political crisis, but actually in the middle of democratic cycles, and how they've managed to deal with this. Many countries were caught in the middle of an election cycle when COVID-19 became such a critical, serious issue. And many have relied on cross-party support to continue caretaker governments. For example, again, in Ireland, we have not had a government in a couple of months, but it's just been established this morning. A coalition government has just been established. The reason that this can be so difficult is to respond to an emergency, you need urgent action, but you also need legal certainty, you need political and democratic oversight to avoid those critical legal failings that we are seeing in states throughout the world. And when you don't have that, you rely on the courts, you rely on judicial oversight, you rely on the capacity to challenge. Now, this is something, again, we're seeing with some difficulty right across the EU, which is courts are closing. I think Hungary closed ordinary courts, which meant that ordinary legislation, regulations couldn't be challenged. But there's also a critical, larger question, especially when we consider reform, which is, can courts even review measures being taken by the executive in a context of COVID-19? We've seen some cases in Romania, in the Czech Republic, trying to ask these questions. And in the case of Spain, there's been quite a statement saying this is not the position of the courts to review the kind of states of emergency. This is not a justiciable question. This is not a question for the courts. To go on to just the two trends that that we've seen throughout the world in terms of first trust and transparency. Now, this actually relates to a very important global question, which is, are autocratic regimes more capable of dealing with the COVID-19 crisis than democratic ones? And my answer, based on the symposium that I ran, which covered 74 countries, or about 80% of the global population, is we're not asking the right question if we say democracy, autocracy, but we're actually asking a question about the legal system itself, the regulatory system, the social system, and also the context of governance as a whole and broadly understood. Exactly why it's so important right now to have an interdisciplinary conversation. The distinguishing factor is trust. Do you have public trust in legally certain, in clear communication? Do you have public trust in the government? Is the government transparent? Are the rules clear? Are they capable of being reviewed and reformed? These are the questions that determine a good response and a negative one. We are seeing that typically among democracies, and typical examples in the EU are the Nordic countries, with some exception of Sweden that take a very different response and different regulatory response to this. The other measure that we're seeing is one of surveillance, sanction, and often militarism. We've seen militarization of the police in Poland. We've seen quite extreme powers being given to the police in Slovenia, but we've also seen an increase in surveillance. This isn't just tracking data, but it's also, tracking without any oversight. Again, the Bulgarian example here, where there was a push for surveillance powers with limited political or judicial oversight, is a prime example of what's concerning. Now, just as I'm aware that I could talk all day about this, I'm instead going to push to the final point, which is reform. Nearly all states have tried to reform their law as soon as possible, with the exceptions of Hungary and Poland, to improve that legal and regulatory chaos. And again, there are very, very simple guiding principles would also and should also guide any kind of constitutional reforms to try and address future crises. The ultimate conclusion of all the work is these are simple principles, and they're universal, that the delegation of power, especially executive power, must be time limited. It must be clear as to its legitimate scope. It must have legitimate scope, and it must be proportionate to that legitimate scope. And there must be meaningful oversight from an independent body, as well as review for those subject to the law. These are clear, universal rule of law principles, but we've seen that states who engage with these principles, who are guided by these principles, have better outcomes, not only in terms of health, but in terms of governance. Clear, simple, universal principles, even in the context of an emergency. So, thank you. Alex, I think you're still muted.
I'm sorry. I'm with you now. No, thank you so much for this very comprehensive and very insightful overview, which I suppose gives us, let's say, one side of the medal of the issues that we're looking into, and it's very much a crisis of legal systems and At the same time, of course, it's a political crisis, and that's, I think, what we will be delving into with Professor Paul Blokker, as precisely the actors that have placed pressure on legal oversight, proportionality, legal certainty, and the rule of law as a whole are populist parties, either in power or as critical opponents. So the floor is yours, Paul.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me on this panel. Unfortunately, I cannot rely on such an extensive and wonderful initiative as Joelle can, and that is her Verfassungsblog investigation, which has been really useful, I think. And I would like to start off not necessarily immediately with populism, but with another aspect that we also announced when promoting this webinar, and that is the dimension of civil society, which is, I think, in many ways fascinating and very difficult in many ways to give a more structural view and understanding of what has happened to civil society. Of course, the first observation that anyone would make is that the COVID-19 crisis has led to a kind of suspension or almost breakdown of civil society because of core rights being in a way frozen. The right to free movement, the right to association, the right in certain ways to expression of opinion. And of course, this is in itself already a striking aspect of the sort of state of emergency situation. And it strikes me as particularly important also in the case of I'm in Italy, where, for instance, a new movement started up in the city where I work in Bologna, the so-called Sardines. You will probably have heard about them. And their whole way of protesting was to crowd up in a square, as they did the first time in Piazza Maggiore in Bologna, some 6,000 people to protest against, in this case, the populists, Matteo Salvini. So their whole way of protesting was exactly that which has been in most countries prohibited. So that is a quite self-evident way of looking at the COVID-19 crisis. Protesting, demonstrations have become much more difficult because of public restrictions, but of course also because of fear of contagion. But at the same time, you might say, and that is equally interesting, I think, about this whole crisis, is that in many ways, the COVID-19 crisis has highlighted key reasons for public protest. Simply issues like socioeconomic inequality, the whole issue about, like here in Italy, one of the main slogans was Io resto a casa, I stay at home. But of course, there's the question of who is able to do that. We as university employed people can quite easily do that, and the transformation hasn't been too difficult. But lots of people, of course, are in sort of layoff schemes, if not worse, which makes indeed a kind of a propensity to protest bigger. So this is in a way an important tension, I think. What is equally interesting, I think, is that even if what many observers have seen as in recent years an increasing wave towards protest has been halted by COVID-19, it hasn't completely disappeared. And so one of the interesting dimensions is, I think, certain forms of innovative protest. We all know the initial reactions in Italy, the sort of the balcony-based types of mobilizations. This was about singing songs and making music, but also had forms of protest and also expressions of solidarity with nurses and hospital personnel, etc. But there have been also pretty quickly forms of so-called social distancing protests. Joelle already mentioned the case of Poland, and of course one of the sneaky things the Polish government tried to pull off was an even greater restriction of abortion legislation, which is already the most restricted in Europe. And the immediate reaction were indeed sort of social distancing protests of a lot of people sort of respecting the rules, but at the same time engaging in protests. We've seen social distance flash mobs. We haven't seen in some countries sort of car marches, so people protesting in their cars. We have seen the emergence of bottom-up so-called mutual support groups, providing foodstuffs, etc., to homeless people and things like that. So public mobilization and protest has not died out. And then on top of that, one of the interesting dimensions of this crisis is, of course, the moving onto digital platforms. And that equally, in terms of civil society mobilization, etc., has taken on new formats in a way, or at least it has become much more prominent. Again, in the sort of the black protests in the abortion legislation case of Poland, we've seen this. We have seen this in many other cases. Widespread use of Twitter, for instance, with hashtags of keep the lockdown, Io resta a casa, I already mentioned it, usage of Facebook. I've been overwhelmed with e-petitions, and you probably have been as well, calling for Euro bonds. There was one in Italy that actually called for supporting the government, and so against the populists that criticize the government. I will come back to that in a second. But of course, this raises also the question of what you could call the digital divide. That is, whom is actually able to engage in these kinds of digital protests, whom is not, who has widespread access to internet. And so classical questions, or at least classical in recent years, of the right to internet, internet regulation, a constitution for internet, as has been discussed also widely in this country, in Italy, are extremely important issues. What is, I think, is equally interesting is how, and I sort of already mentioned this in a way, is how the COVID crisis has pushed into the limelight certain issues that became in a way clearer. That is, for instance, issues about the environment, about pollution. I've been a bit shocked, by the way, how there was an initial discussion of how the crisis might actually kickstart imported legislation in this direction, but then the minute the crisis peters off a little bit, nobody talks about it anymore, and that's a missed opportunity for sure. A further issue I think that should be mentioned is how Joelle, of course, talked mostly about the legislative and the legal dimensions, which also brings in, I think, the role of expertise and technocracy. But there's another dimension too that is, I think, fascinating, and that is the dimension of public opinion. I'm thinking, for instance, of the case of the Netherlands, where the government of Mark Rutte clearly tapped into, on the one hand, expertise to generate a kind of legitimacy and trust in the government, but at the same time tapped into directly into public opinion to pull off certain measures like closing schools that experts actually said were not necessary, but that were seen as psychologically reassuring. So that's an interesting dimension too. And by the way, what I found peculiar, particularly in the Dutch case, is that Mark Rutte, the prime minister, talked about an intelligent lockdown, much contested then, of course, because it wasn't always very clear how intelligent this was. The issues of legal uncertainty in many ways, and decree laws, and et cetera, of course, has been prominent in the Dutch case too. The final issue then, and that brings me indeed to populism, that is striking and scary in many ways, I think, is that, of course, civil society includes also what some call, I think with a bit of a misnomer, but what some would call uncivil society. And so we have equally seen in many societies protests against lockdown measures, most dramatically so in the US, of course, with people carrying arms, etc. But also in the case of Germany, for instance, far-right groups protesting against lockdown measures. In Italy, it has been particularly the populist right, Giorgia Meloni of Fratelli d'Italia, and then also, of course, Matteo Salvini, who have been engaging in occupation of parliament, Salvini, and then Meloni protesting in front of the parliament against restrictive measures, etc. And what is particularly, I think, scary about these protests is that there's often an underlying reference to how the pandemics is a hoax, how often involving also no-vax movements, and then spreading often all kinds of what I would see at least as forms of fake news, that Bill Gates is behind a big global conspiracy of selling off vaccination, etc., which is indeed showing one of the key problems in civil society currently, and that is around issues of fake news, mobilization around certain thematics. From civil society going to populist reactions, I found it fairly difficult, and I've also been teaching a class on populism right in the middle of the COVID-19 crisis to American students, actually, and I found it particularly difficult to see a clear pattern of populist reactions. There are, of course, the much spoken of reactions by populists in government, if we still want to call them like that. As in the case of Viktor Orban, it's probably better to speak of a dictatorship by now, which would be much beyond populism. But this has not been the type of populist in government reaction of Hungary and Poland. Strengthening authoritarian tendencies has not been visible all the way through. Like the case in Italy was, for instance, that Salvini, who has been a bit schizophrenic, to put it mildly, but at least in a number of instances has criticized the government for authoritarian reactions, for too strict lockdown measures, etc. But on the other side, you see Thierry Baudet, for instance, in the Netherlands, who is pretty close in certain ways to right-wing populists like Salvini, actually calling for stricter measures in the initial weeks of lockdown in the Netherlands, criticizing the government for being too lax. And so it's not very easy to identify clear patterns here. I think there's clearly, on the one hand, the case that COVID-19 has strengthened some of the key objectives of populists, like in terms of closure of borders, of forms of nationalism, of strengthening of executive powers, etc. But at the same time, in many cases, populists have lost consensus. Again, Salvini has dropped by at least 10 points in the public polls, which is impressive because he was going pretty strong the last year or so from the European parliamentary elections onwards. And so in that sense, it's not easy to project also what then will happen if indeed the trend towards a less strict state of emergency, so to speak, a relaxing of rules, etc., whether populists will veer back again. Many observers tend to argue that it's likely that Salvini and that kind of right-wing populist will gain political strength again because of the economic breakdown of all the social implications of the crisis. But so far, we can't see strong tendencies in that direction. Going from populist to a more structural set of observations about the legal constitutional situation, and as indeed Joelle indicated, the whole issue around the state of emergency, either a real state of emergency or a kind of more ordinary legislative approach, has often indeed seen at least temporary concentration of power, of decision-making power in the hands of executives. It has seen suspension of forms of divisions of powers, of monitoring between state institutions, etc., monitoring opportunities also for civil society, of course. And I tend to agree with Joelle that key issues here are really about, on the one hand, to what extent was there a clear indication of, let's say, a kind of sunset clause, so a temporary nature to the measures or not? And of course, Hungary is the clear case here in which this was always either absent or vague, depending a bit on the interpretation. The second issue is, of course, the scope and the proportionality of the policies adopted. But one thing that strikes me, and that I would really feel needs much more consideration, and I think in a way Joelle already indicated this, is to what extent is COVID-19 part of an ongoing trend of a kind of emergency interpretation of executive powers that has been going on for a long time, at least since 9/11, and probably even earlier in some cases, like in France, with anti-terrorism, counter-terrorism legislation. And so we have the 9/11 war on terror crisis that led to certain measures that clearly curtail particular fundamental rights. We have the financial and economic crisis 2007, 2008, and the euro crisis in Europe that equally led to certain measures that curtailed specific rights. Then we have the terrorist crisis, the Islamic State of 2015 onwards, together with the migration crisis. All these crises, I think, can be easily read as pushing towards a certain approach towards policymaking that reduces oversight powers, that reduces parliamentary inclusion in decision making, and that reduces the role of civil society involvement and monitoring, and what Pierre-Rose Vallon so nicely calls forms of counter-democracy. So that's something I believe that is really something to think about, and it relates also to a kind of securitization, perhaps in combination with militarization of society, that sometimes expresses itself in forms of what some scholars call penal populism. We've seen this in Italy very strongly under the Lega five-star movement government, but the succeeding government didn't really backtrack on those types of measures. And so in that sense, COVID-19 is simply strengthening certain forms of political state behavior. I don't want to sound like the Italian political philosopher Giorgio Agamben, who sees the state of emergency as sort of everywhere, but this is definitely something to think about. So on a finishing note then, if we go to the larger picture, an interim conclusion seems to be, in terms of democracy, in terms of relations to civil society, that those countries that were already on a kind of authoritarian track, and Hungary and Poland are the key cases in Europe, of course, there it has clearly been an opportunity to strengthen these tendencies. In other societies, I think this is less clear. And for instance, in the case of Italy, as one of the first cases in the COVID-19 crisis, the first case in Europe, this is not so clear at all. And so it might actually be that Italian democracy is held up better than some would have expected beforehand. I leave it there. Thank you, and well, maybe we can come back to some of these issues in the Q&A.
Absolutely, Paul. Thank you so much. I think it really brings into focus how the current crisis, COVID-19, is an excellent tool to really take a closer look to trends that are not new, but that perhaps have been deepening in the past few years, and with the crisis have really come to the fore. And so from as you say, the digital divide within broader civil society, to kind of the mixed effectiveness of populist rhetoric and the move towards kind of executive-driven decision-making, securitization. I think these are all the big questions that we should be thinking about, and that perhaps we can go back to in the Q&A discussion. And now we move on to our next speaker, Cassandra Emmons, who will kind of give us a bit more insight in how human rights law can kind of provide us some more insight as to kind of the extent of government's overreach in the context of COVID-19. You have the floor.
Great, thank you. Thanks a lot, Alex, for the very kind invitation to participate in this today. In many ways, I think what I will say complements what Joelle and Paul have said very well, so this is great. So we've heard now about the interaction between the civil society level and the national level, and Joelle starting from the national level, looking to the international, and I'll take the, I guess, top-down approach from that and start with our international human rights treaties and what that means when we think coming back down to the national level. So we'll see, maybe we'll keep doing this stepwise progression through the webinar today. So while states bear the responsibility of protecting their people and their nations, of course, modern day international human rights law was designed precisely to protect people from governments that might abuse or overstep their powers. So for those of you who maybe have not seen it, in the piece that I contributed to Joelle's brilliantly curated Verfassungsblog Symposium, I outlined what the limits are for a number of regional organizations and a full global human rights treaty, and what limits they do and don't impose on governments in times of acute crises. So I'll sort of frame my comments today around three general questions, moving with the theme of the webinar. So first, what does international law say about protecting human rights during emergencies, or in this case, pandemics? And so by that, I really mean, what limits does international human rights law impose on governments during these times? So to give a long form answer, I of course don't have to remind this group that there's more than just the national and then the global level, right? You have the regional level. And so most of the conversations I've heard, though, have been really focused on the national to the global. And so I think it's very important to call attention to this intermediary level here, especially with respect to human rights treaties, because there are several that live at that level. So we can focus on four. The universal one is, of course, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, or the ICCPR. And then regionally, the American Convention on Human Rights, the European Convention on Human Rights, and the European Social Charter, which all have things to say about living under pandemics and the states of emergency. So under any state of emergency, pandemic or otherwise, there are certain rights that can never be derogated. This is the right to life, the prohibition of slavery and torture, and protection from retroactive legislation, right? And then when you move to the regional level, you have a couple additional ones. So within Europe, the death penalty is non-derogable at any point in time, as well as double jeopardy under the law. For parties to the ICCPR, as well as in the Americas, you're still afforded your right to legal personality, your freedom of thought and religion, and you are, this is important, guaranteed judicial processes, even in emergency situations. So again, going back to what Joelle had been saying, where we see some of the courts no longer functioning as they usually do, should really keep this in mind, that even under times of emergency, under the ICCPR, you are not allowed to prohibit people from having their right to a guaranteed judicial process. So the American Convention, also just to call attention to this, has the longest set of non-derogable rights of any of these conventions. And so other things that they include are continued observance of humane treatment while in custody, freedom from forced labor, rights of the child and family, rights of name and nationality, and the right to participate in government. So again, coming back to the question of what do we do about all the elections that COVID-19 has disrupted, the American Convention very clearly states the right to participate in government cannot be foregone for any sort of emergency situation. So we know, though, from the VBlog Symposium and also what Joelle's already explained, that not all countries have taken the emergency route in response to COVID. So for the governments that haven't taken that route, we might think, okay, well then all rights stand, must be protected. Not so much. There's actually a few clauses that implore their signatory governments to be proactive in securing public health and well-being, especially and sometimes particularly vis-a-vis epidemics. So it's actually mentioned in the counterpart to the ICCPR, the International Covenant of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And we can add another regional organization here. The African Charter of Human and People's Rights specifically mentions what you can and cannot do, or should and should not do in times of public health emergencies. So in the interest of public health, signatory governments are required to, are permitted to restrict whether or not they've declared a state of emergency, the practice of one's religion, not the thought of the religion, but the practice, respect for private and family life, and then movement, freedom of movement, assembly, association, and even expression. So it's not very detailed in what exactly the form of those restrictions are, but they are legally allowed to be restricted during times of public health emergencies. So given that's sort of the lay of the land, how have government's actions aligned with international law? And if they've not aligned, are there any ways that those can be enforced? So when a signatory state suspends rights during a crisis, they're obligated to inform the relevant international body at least twice. Joelle mentioned this briefly, right? So at first, they're supposed to say what rights are being derogated and explain why it's necessary, what the condition of the emergency is that this needs to happen. And then they're also supposed to inform the same body when that emergency crisis is no longer happening, once it's concluded and the rights have been fully restored. So I've been following the notifications of derogations to the Council of Europe, and actually only 8 signatory states so far have reported their state of emergency. And this is Albania, Armenia, Georgia, Latvia, North Macedonia, Romania, San Marino, and Serbia. They're the only ones that have formally announced that they have issued a state of emergency. 6 of those have actually followed up and said, our original state of emergency had an expiration date, we've extended it for another period of 30 days or whatever their national constitutions permit. So there are generally 2 means of enforcing those agreements, though. One's through the court, obviously, and the second is monitoring. And in my mind, neither of these are sufficient to address the crisis that we're facing right now. So there are 2 problems with relying on the court. So the first is just the sheer amount of time a case like this takes, right? Not only because the court requires all domestic remedies are exhausted before you can actually even bring the case. So if you're in a state where the courts aren't really functioning, you can't even exhaust the domestic remedies before you can take it to that level. So there is a huge gap here in the potential for those proceedings. And then for something as fast-paced as COVID, by the time you could actually get to that level, what could have happened in the country of question, right? All kinds of derogations from these human rights obligations could have already taken place. So the second thing is what you might have noticed from the list of countries I read off is that not every state that has declared a state of emergency has reported it. So this reporting gap creates huge enforcement problems. For example, we've mentioned already, Hungary has its enabling act is in effect a state of emergency, but has not been reported to the Council of Europe. And so even if someone according to Article 15, of course, there's no time frame within which you must report, but case law at the court has established already in 2 cases that once it was a delay of 3 months, another time it was a delay of 4 months, and the court said this is too long. On the other end, it was reported within 12 days and the court accepted that. So we have a vague sense of at least what is too long in the court's eyes for a reporting of derogations of these rights. So still, this is a huge flaw, right? Just in the way that these treaties are written. And this is something that maybe down the line, if we're thinking about reform, this is of course a very high level change that would need to be made, but it's something that we might be ambitious and try to take on in a true post-COVID era. But the problem with using the court, of course, until there's a formal report of those derogations, the court can't look at it. So what else do you have to do? You can look for monitoring, which international organizations are very good at this. This is something a lot of them have the capacity to do. But COVID presents challenges to this as well because travel is mostly off the table. So if your goal is you're going to go to the country and see what's actually happening there, but you can't go to the country, you're then left to, having to observe from a distance. And so you have to, if you have to observe from afar, you have to rely on the data that's coming from within that country. Usually, international organizations are interacting and talking with other government actors, but there's no incentive for a government that has, derogated some of these rights potentially to self-report, right? So then this is going to help me transition to my third point and come back to some of the things that Paul was talking about. My third question being, what role is there for human rights law in the recovery period? And more precisely, what can international organizations, transnational institutions do? And one of these things is to strengthen channels of communication directly with its citizens, right? They can also work to ensure equitable distribution of aid. And I think that there are a few ways that they can do this in some more and less direct ways. A very interesting example at the UNHCR, Michelle Bachelet, the former president of Chile, who's now the High Commissioner there, has called for explicit attention to the protection for women and girls who are more frequently working in the informal sector and domestic work, as well as migrants and indigenous populations, right? So this inclusive focus I'd like to amplify this call that she's making while I have this platform here, because this set of guidelines, she's really been quite inclusive of different groups that need special attention. So besides guidelines though, in the movement for equitable distribution of aid, we can think about the logistics of distribution of a vaccine when there is one that needs to be widely distributed. Right? So there's some excellent people who are already thinking about this and who have a lot of experience with distributing vaccines for other illnesses that have now been nearly eradicated or at least very much under control. So the other thing that international organizations can do is support those, some of them are private-public partnerships that have that experience, right? So transnational organizations like the WHO have really come under fire in this period, but it's not just because of COVID, right? That's part of a broader backlash against international actors. A little bit, I think that was already mentioned. But at present, right, the WHO is funded by a combination of assessed and voluntary contributions. And those voluntary contributions are typically earmarked for specific projects. So there's a few ways that the WHO could think about how they would reapproach this in the future, right? So one of the optional funds that those voluntary contributions can be earmarked for is called the Emergency Operations and Appeals Fund. So that's primarily what COVID is being funded out of right now. But there is room for loosening some of the restrictions on voluntary contributions that have been already earmarked for something when you're faced with something unprecedented like COVID-19, right? It's also a very good example of a private-public partnership here, right? So the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Gavi Vaccine Alliance are two of the top 4 contributors to the WHO, or at least they were in 2018. So one of the things that organizations can do, organizations that really hold these principles outlined in the international human rights treaties to heart, is really coordinate and pool that expertise and encourage funding for those causes beyond the moment that we're in, right? You always see the push for doing something while the crisis is here, but once it's, behind us, I'm talking 2-5 years down the line, funding for research into these kinds of things and pooling the resources and maintaining them for the next pandemic is going to be very, very important. And so lastly, I wanted to just anecdotally note, and we've been talking a little bit about, internet access. And so I think that's really important to think about too, because yes, I started up at the Meta, right, the international organizations, but there are ways to get that information to people, and we need to be more creative in how we expect institutions to communicate with people. So you could be living in a country where either the government is disincentivized to inform you as a citizen, or they simply don't have the resources to be able to fully, conduct their own independent investigations, and they don't have the scientists within the cabinet to sort of figure out on their own what steps we need to take to put COVID at bay. So information provision maybe is a little bit boring, but it's such an important contribution that international actors can play for people who are living under a wide variety of circumstances. The hard work comes in when we need to think about ways to get creative about disseminating that information to people in underdeveloped places, people without broadband internet, and so on. So this is a myriad of options, places that I think international organizations, transnational actors might be able to intervene. And I will leave it there and happy to hear if people have other thoughts in the Q&A.
Thank you so much for adding another piece of our puzzle. I think once again, kind of highlighting how COVID-19 it's presenting us with new challenges, of course, but it's also, on the other hand, an opportunity to find ways to improve, international cooperation on these issues, and be creative, as you say, with the solutions that we find. And now, finally, we come to our last speaker, Andrea Sangiovanni, who will be, as I mentioned before, focusing on the SURE scheme, but that kind of feeds into the far broader discussion on the matter of solidarity, which of course has been at the heart of a lot of debates surrounding the EU and the current crisis. So it's my pleasure now to give the floor to Andrea.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm not sure, can you see the PowerPoint?
We can.
Yes, you can. Okay, fantastic. So thanks so much for this invitation to talk to you today about some of these questions. So we've heard from Joelle and Cassandra the more legal side, both at the national level and the international level, and from Paul a more political perspective. So what I'm going to try to give you here is a more ethical perspective on COVID, and in particular to ask in a European context what solidarity requires of us. So to make it a bit more specific, of course, solidarity is mentioned everywhere in the European Union. It's mentioned over 22 times in the Lisbon Treaty. It's mentioned in myriad, commission reports and speeches and in public debate. But it's really amazing that people never really stop to think, well, what exactly is solidarity? People have a vague sense of what it is, but not what it specifically requires of us. And in the recent crisis, those calls for solidarity have become even more important, of course. And indeed, there's been a lot of skepticism about Europe's role in responding to calls for solidarity. Particularly in Italy, for example, there was a lot of disappointment that the European response was weak and coming late. But recently, there's been some movement. So the crisis has been a spur to move the EU towards a much more solidaristic approach, a much more centralized fiscal capacity in particular. And one of the aspects of those new policies in view of COVID is what's called SURE. So that's the EU's basically short-term work compensation scheme, and SURE is temporary support to mitigate unemployment risks in an emergency. And so this is just one aspect of a whole raft of funds that have been dedicated to the COVID crisis. And what I want to do is not so much discuss SURE itself, which is kind of a first step, but there's a background to SURE. So in the background of SURE was many steps since about 2012 for establishing some kind of unemployment insurance at the European level. And so there's been tentative steps in that direction. And SURE is really the first concrete step moving in that way. So what I want to talk about is how SURE can give us the first step, the first move in that direction, and then to talk about how solidarity and the value of solidarity might support a much more thoroughgoing unemployment insurance scheme at the European level. So just a quick review of what SURE is. It's 100 billion euros in loans that's meant to cover the cost of short-term work schemes. So whenever there's, in the case of COVID, there's been lots of pressure on businesses, many of whom had to lay off many workers. So one of the schemes that governments use is to provide so-called furlough schemes or short-term work schemes. So instead of laying off workers, what you do is you can pay them to remain on the payroll but not to work. And so for those schemes, the EU said, yes, we will help. We will provide funds from EU coffers, from EU loans, to help states in dealing with an upsurge of expenditure related to short-term work schemes. Now, it's interesting, in this case, the scheme requires states to apply for funds, and then those funds are dispersed as loans to states, which then they have to pay back. And so we might wonder, well, is that really enough for solidarity? And shouldn't solidarity require much more? Why just in COVID? Why shouldn't the EU, for example, the Eurozone, support a much more thoroughgoing scheme? Okay, you know, such schemes that the unemployment insurance schemes are often talked about as expressions of solidarity. Here's the 5 Presidents report, which I won't read to you, but of course it concludes this paragraph. This common destiny, the destiny of monetary union, when states give up certain crucial levers that they have, fiscal autonomy, monetary policy autonomy, they give up their ability to devalue their currency in the case of an exogenous shock. And the 5 Presidents report, among others, from 2015 says, look, this kind of thing, monetary union, giving up these powers, we recognize that it requires solidarity when there are exogenous shocks. Of course, this was in the wake of the Eurozone crisis. But what does that solidarity require of us? So here's an argument, and I'll be very brief here. This is a bit of the background, the normative framework that I use for thinking through these questions. So first, I want you to start with an assumption. I argue for it at greater length elsewhere, but here just start with the assumption that it's actually legitimate for member state publics to retain some kind of meaningful self-determination over the basic character of their social policy. Okay, so we imagine that states have a good argument against, for example, just replacing their national social schemes with a European level scheme. Okay, so start with that assumption. So then what's the point and purpose of the EU if we start with that assumption? So the idea here is that the EU in fact serves to secure for its constituent welfare states the benefits of integration, in our case from, say, monetary union, while indemnifying them against the materialization of risks that foreseeably come with it, like exposure to exogenous shocks, which states now don't have the tools they once had for dealing with. So in this view, the EU, as a kind of expression of solidarity, should be conceived of as an insurance union. An insurance union for welfare states once they agree to integrate with one another. Okay, fine. So it's an insurance union. It should help states when they are in crisis, when there's shocks. But what kind of insurance? And a crucial question here is to what extent insurance should be what's called ex ante redistributive or not. So to put it in German, the German politician's term, whether insurance over the long run should be redistributive, or whether it should only be redistributive in the short run. So of course, if you're in a shock, you receive a payout from the insurance fund, but what about over the long term? Over the long term, the idea is that insurance should be neutral. It should be proportional to the to what you've paid in via like a premium or a tax or whatever. But the question is, should it be more redistributive than that? Are there arguments for an insurance that's more redistributive than a classic pure insurance model? So to give you a sense of what pure insurance requires, if you were designing, say, a car insurance scheme, you would want that insurance to be, the premiums that are charged, to be proportional to the risk that drivers have, so or drive with, as it were. So you would expect high-risk drivers to pay more for their policy. Why should low-risk drivers subsidize high-risk drivers? So you should expect that over time, that you get in exactly what you pay out, and it should be proportional to your level of risk. That's called actuarial fairness when we're talking about insurance schemes. And you might think, well, look, an unemployment insurance scheme at the European level should be actuarially fair. But is that always how we think of insurance? Well, no. Think of compulsory social insurance at the member state level. So we're talking about individuals. Indeed, think of unemployment insurance. So here we have risk profiles for unemployment. So the idea that different people are face different risks of unemployment. For example, if you work in a manual sector or in the non-manual sector, you have a different level of risk with respect to getting unemployed through your working life. And indeed, different individuals, according to their educational background, their social class, will face different risks in unemployment. Think of, so there are high-risk groups for unemployment and low-risk groups. Now, do we think that an insurance market that covers unemployment at the individual level should be actuarially fair? Do we think that the high-risk groups should pay more than the low-risk groups? No. We treat at the domestic level those differences in risk profile as irrelevant, right? Now, why do we do that? Well, one reason is that we recognize that our own ability, whoever we are, to gain in a market, in a free market, in a job market, is dependent on everyone else's contribution to a basic structure of law that makes us able to develop our talents and abilities. What would your fancy programming skills be worth, say, in a state of nature? And the second reason is that we think that these factors, the factors that determine our risk profile vis-a-vis unemployment, are largely, though not exclusively, of course, beyond our immediate control. It's not our fault if we don't have as good an education as someone else, or we weren't born in a social class that had, that permitted us to be less likely to become unemployed over our working life, right? Okay, so what about, there it is. So what about member states? How should we think about risk profile? Should we think of an unemployment insurance scheme at the European level as more like the case of the car insurance, so pure insurance scheme, or more like the case of compulsory social insurance at the domestic level with individuals? So from the point of view of COVID, if we're thinking about COVID, here it seems much more obvious that we should treat the insurance scheme like SURE, like the case of compulsory social insurance. We shouldn't mind that it's redistributive, say from countries that were less affected by COVID to countries that were more affected by COVID, like suppose Italy. And we think exactly for the same reason as we did with the individual level at the, in the compulsory social insurance case. We think, well, it's not, you can't hold Italy particularly responsible for having been hit the hardest. It's not their fault. So that's why a much more redistributive scheme is legitimate. Okay, but we accept that with respect to COVID. What about more generally? What about exogenous shocks that are a result of monetary union more generally, something like the Eurozone crisis? What do we say about that case? So here we have to determine, well, what are the factors that make member states more and less likely to be subject to exogenous shocks and to be less able to respond to them when they do hit? And I want to suggest to you things like high debt, weak governance, corruption, clientelism, and so on. Low productivity and inefficient labor institutions will be factors that make you more likely to suffer and to more likely both to be subject to an exogenous shock within a monetary union and also less likely to come out of it well. So those kind of things make you a high-risk member state. So now the question becomes, well, should we hold member states, publics, responsible for those factors that make them more high risk? Should we treat it like the case of car insurance? or again, like the case of compulsory social insurance. What I want to suggest to you is, in fact, these are factors that are much more like the case of education and social class in the individual case at the domestic level, more like our compulsory social insurance case than the car insurance case. And that's because while these factors can be influenced by policy, they're sticky, they're structural aspects of a state that are not easy to change in the short to medium term. It's not like any one election can make a difference between being high debt or low debt, or having strong governance or not strong governance. So these are factors I think that we would be hard pressed to say that member state publics should be responsible for, in the sense of having to pay a higher premium for. We should treat them much more like the compulsory social insurance case. So to sum up, what I think we ought to have is a European insurance scheme that we should ask, what would a member state choose? What type of unemployment insurance scheme would a member state choose if it knew the distribution of risks, those risk profiles we discussed before, but not its place in that distribution? So we kind of apply a veil of ignorance, what's called, political philosophers call a veil of ignorance. We ask, if you didn't know whether you were going to be Germany or Greece or Spain or Latvia, what kind of insurance policy would you purchase against unemployment, against having rising expenditures and unemployment in an exogenous shock within a monetary union? Okay, so that's the question it becomes, and that kind of veil of ignorance is justified because we don't treat those risk profile as aspects of member states' governing arrangements for which they are directly responsible. So we treat it much more like unemployment insurance at the domestic level. Okay, now here to wrap up, I just want to show you I have a scheme that I would like to propose that I think follows quite nicely from these assumptions that I've just mentioned. I'll just list them very quickly. I'm not going to, if you want to discuss them in a kind of Q&A, I'd be happy to. So we should have a fund that pays out, in fact, 0.5% of member state GDP for every 1% increase in total employment over the 7-year moving average in total unemployment. So here the idea is that states get a payout from this reinsurance scheme at the European level when their cyclical unemployment goes above a certain level. So it's not the structural unemployment, the long-term unemployment that we care about, it's the cyclical unemployment that comes from an exogenous shock. So when there's a sudden rise in unemployment, then the fund pays out. And it pays out 0.5% of member state GDP for every 1% increase. That's funded by a yearly national contribution of 0.35% of member state GDP. And there would be an option to borrow at the EU level if the funds were depleted. To give you an idea of how much that would be, between 1990 and 2017, if we had such a scheme, the maximum payout would have been to Greece, which would have received a net transfer of 5.65% of its GDP in 2013. Now here, the important aspect of this scheme is that we don't try to correct for redistribution in the long run. So even if it turns out that some states are paying more into the scheme than they get out, we're okay with that. And that's for that argument I gave before about what solidarity requires in the case of a fair insurance scheme. So the argument that there should be no permanent transfers or no transfer union in the EU is wrong. It's the incorrect interpretation of what solidarity requires of us. Okay, I've spoken enough, so I'm just going to stop there. I can say more about exactly how many transfers there would be and more about the scheme itself, but for now, I'll just leave it there. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Andrea, for your very convincing arguments and narrative, and for presenting this very convincing proposal, which kind of tackles the very real challenges in terms of solidarity that COVID-19 has raised. We're now, I think, moving on to our Q&A and further discussion. we will start with a couple of questions from the audience. Of course, whoever is still with us, feel free to send us your questions. And there's one first question from Sean Handley, who points to one of the broader issues that was actually touched upon, I think, by Paul towards the beginning, which is whether COVID-19 has kind of reinforced technocracy and technocratic legitimation to the detriment of kind of democratic oversight. And I think this links very well to the tendencies that well, a lot of you, many of you have highlighted, of executive-driven decision-making and so on. So perhaps Paul, Joelle, Cassandra, you could perhaps elaborate a little bit on that.
I suppose, oh yeah, I suppose it's my turn, right?
Go for it.
Okay, and so to elaborate on the dimension of the role of technocracy and expert knowledge in the way policymaking has tried to address COVID-19. Well, I think that's in itself an extremely interesting question also in terms of comparative analysis. I don't have a full overview of, for instance, how different countries in Europe have reacted. Of course, Joelle's set of contributions Symposium might help us there, but I haven't read every single statement there, I have to admit. But it seems to me that there's, on the one hand, a peculiar reacceptance of expert knowledge in a context in which that expert knowledge is actually not providing a lot of certainty. So one wonders what the implications might be there. I've been living through this crisis in Italy, being indeed in my confined in my home in Florence, and the contribution of experts to provide knowledge for policy making has been extremely uneven and very much in tension between various experts. And I think this has been the case almost everywhere. So one might wonder what the implications are in future forms of policy making in similar types of crisis. But another thing that struck me also is how in some cases, like for instance in Italy, at least half of the government is a kind of populist movement, the 5-star movement, one of the most difficult to define, I think, around Europe. And there, one of the striking things has always been in their populism that they always already included a kind of pro-technocratic position. And so this has also perhaps meant, in the case of the Italian government, that there has been a certain acceptance of including technocratic an emphasis on technocratic knowledge and consultancy in policy making in these times of urgency. So that's my 5 cents to this dimension.
I'm happy again to jump in with some global insights in terms of expertise. This is critically a medical emergency. We have seen okay, from my perspective, one of the most interesting conversations to be having is how roles have changed across the world and how we've seen doctors taking on very different roles. For example, we've seen doctors taking on the roles of detention officers in Canada. And this is correlating strongly with roles being taken on by very different groups that we don't normally associate with having necessarily that training or expertise. So during my presentation, I mentioned how we're seeing the militarization, or rather the military are taking on police functions. That's not only in Poland, but we've also seen that, for example, in Israel. And as Paul mentioned, we've seen the public taking on roles of epidemiologists in the Netherlands. But this is also similar to police and soldiers taking on medical functions in Slovakia. So we're seeing roles being assumed under the guise of urgency and emergency. Now, in terms of the role of technocrats and the role of expertise, obviously they're very important questions that I, as an expert in the rule of law, will always keep asking, which is, where's oversight? And what I always come back to as the ultimate point of ultimate answer, I suppose, is when you have less political accountability, and by that I mean you have less options and availability for Parliament's meeting, for select committees oversight, when you have less possibility for political accountability, you must have more public rationality. You must have more communication with the public as to who's making decisions, why these decisions are being made, and the rational justifications for that decision making. So in the context of all of these rules changing, in the context of increase, as you accurately have asked about technocracy, we must see an increase in public rationality.
Yeah, I'll just add like a 2-sentence response. So I'm in the United States, and so no, I don't think everywhere in the world has there been a reliance on or a move towards putting more trust in the technocrats and the experts, and that's to a lot of people's detriment, right? So data from these experts is being seen through a filter of national interest, and I think that's really important to keep in mind. And what we see is a doubting of data depending on the source, and this is really problematic, right? So President Trump here doesn't trust the data that the WHO puts out because he says that they're in China's pocket, right? But like, so what do we do? I guess the question and the onus, unfortunately, is put back on the technocrats and the experts to say, this is how we've verified the data. This is how we've made the data comparable across places. And that's something that's been a struggle in past pandemics. I don't think it's unique to now. I think it's reinforced for those of us who are mindful of it, the need of those people to do that work. But for policy making, I don't think it's evenly been taken into account.
Thank you so much for that, and also to bring Andrea into the discussion. I was thinking how this relates to the perception of the European Union, which kind of in a popular understanding of technocracy, it's often been seen as an illegitimate, a technocratic system, and therefore illegitimate. And I'm wondering, in the context of the current crisis, I think there is a fuzziness in that perception, and also an expectation, on the other hand, of the EU to intervene with such schemes as SURE, which have been, as you know, of course, in the works for quite some time. So I'm wondering, is the current crisis kind of preparing the ground for more willingness for a stronger role for the European Union in these kinds of circumstances?
Yes, well, I think it's a really interesting question whether it is or it isn't. So there's been a lot of discussion since the Eurozone crisis. There's been an increasing recognition that there has to be, at the European level, some kind of centralized fiscal capacity to flank monetary union. The monetary unions without a centralized fiscal capacity are fragile. And so there's been a growing recognition. I mean, you've seen it, it's kind of a rolling ball of moves in this direction. And a big shift came in 2018 when Olaf Scholz in Germany took over the finance ministry. And in virtue of his role there and some hires that he's made, that's made Germany much more amenable to creating some kind of fiscal capacity at the European level. In fact, there was a leaked paper out of the German government supporting Olaf Scholz, supporting, particularly in 2018, I think, 2019, no, it was October 2018, supporting specifically an unemployment insurance scheme at the European level as a way of moving forward on this. So there were all these moves in that direction, but of course there was a lot of pushback, especially from countries like the Frugal Four, right? As we've heard now, they've been, Austria, Netherlands, Finland, Denmark. So there's been a lot of pushback. And it's always turning on this question of permanent transfers and moral hazard. So these questions to do with insurance. So that's why my argument is, as it were, tailored to exactly this type of argument. But with COVID, there was a recognition that a lot of these arguments just don't work because it's no one's fault, right? And the EU was taking a big hit that it was so late. I mean, in Italy, and then I'll shut up. It was very marked that, you know, what was it? There was the whole thing with Germany and the masks, and they weren't sending the masks and so on. And then China was brilliant at this moment, kind of soft power, you know, sent over a few doctors and some masks to Italy. And then all of a sudden the Italians were like, oh, China is doing everything, you know, the Europe has left us on the door, whereas China is coming to our, and so China is taking advantage in many ways, is slowly moving, you know, with the Belt and Road Initiative and buying out some of the Eastern European states, is trying to get in places where Europe has been failing or been late or dragging its feet. And so I think this was all a bit of a wake-up call. And so there was a push on the COVID funds with an amenable German government. And now the post-recovery funds are quite meaningful, I think. So, you know, the real question is, are they temporary? For now they are. But could this, you know, once you open that door, could we then build on it? And that's the hope, and I'm hopeful. I mean, you know, but that's the hope. But we still have to make the argument and win it, you know, as it were.
Indeed, indeed, absolutely. And again, to go back to our audience questions, and one that kind of relates to how we are now that we're kind of approaching, hopefully, the aftermath of the current crisis. How are we reacting to it, and how are we recovering? And I think a big question is, of course, when it comes to investing or reinvesting in kind of highly polluting businesses and these kinds of industries, how will kind of the green and sustainable development and climate change issues be maintained at the top of the agenda in the coming months, in the coming years? And this is from Anton Mingzigao. Anyone that would like to share any thoughts on this?
I mean, I can jump in. This is a critical issue. I think how the political conversation is going to be defined or framed and engaged with over the coming months and potentially over the coming years, especially when we're now becoming concerned about second waves and when a second wave would hit, or even third waves, or even the possibility of a vaccine. But all of this to say, how initial responses and ongoing responses are framed is going to be critical to whether or not we can have those incredibly important conversations of global emergency, global environmental emergency, and the aspect of polluting, exactly as you've just said, and also how this relates. One reality that I would like to pick up on a little bit in this context, with also the caveat that I'm not in any way an expert on environmental issues, but one very important element that came out so strongly to me throughout all the country reports that I was reading was the disproportionate effect that not only the virus itself, but also the measures that were adopted throughout the world, the disproportionate effect that these had on vulnerable populations. This is not only in terms of immunocompromised and the elderly or, well, older population, but also critically on low-income casual workers, a majority of whom are women, especially in terms of those who have insecure housing or unsecure housing, who are unemployed, in prison, refugee, migrants, indigenous populations. This crisis has critically hit the most vulnerable populations. Just to come back on the previous point on technology, the fact that we're all here, the fact that those who are making decisions are able to engage with good internet connection, which we have had, Paul, so really well done. But critically, what we're seeing in this crisis is a disproportionate effect on the most vulnerable. And inevitably, when environmental concerns are raised, this is, again, critical for the most vulnerable populations throughout the world. All of this to say, how we define the debate, probably online over the next few months and years, this will be critical. We're going to see what approaches are being adopted and whether or not we will rightly and correctly engage with the real environmental concerns for those next bigger, potentially even more severe global disasters. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much for that further insight. We have kind of a broad question which address, I think, the interesting point of how there has been a pattern, a tendency of moving policy forward through crisis politics, essentially. And I guess that raises a lot of questions, both in a legal and political sense, of whether there are other ways in which change can be achieved, and what impact these kind of circumstances have on the kind of change that can be achieved under these circumstances. And I guess it's a kind of a broad question that encompasses all of the areas that we've touched upon. This comes from Andreas Shopkins, but we also have a more specific question from Carolina Lubis, who asks, what do we need to construct in current international law systems in order to make it more responsive, a more responsive legal system in the post-COVID-19 era? And I think in all of the areas that we've discussed, these are kind of the big questions that we're struggling with. So if anyone has any thoughts or reflections on this, go ahead. Paul, Andrea, or
stab at the first one, right? So can change be achieved in other ways? Like, yes, of course it can. But what do we observe if we look over time? It's in moments where there are crises, like this, unprecedented moments where there is a collective rethinking of what we expect from our institutions, what we expect from our governments, what we expect from our experts, that really paves the way for a fundamental, a bigger rewriting, right, of some of the rules of the game. So yes, it could be achieved other ways, but I think, as I believe Paul, you had said, like, this moment is presenting an opportunity to do things differently. And so to squander that would be a huge, huge mistake for, you know, the EU institutions, for governmental institutions, the NGOs, for everybody, right? It's just called so much of what we do day to day into question, that the question that I think is more important is, what change can we achieve right now, given what we've learned about our society and about our systems from the crisis?
Absolutely.
May I add something to that as well? I mean, I'm not an expert on this particular element I'm going to introduce, but one dimension we didn't really talk about is subnational government and urban government and the role of mayors, which in many countries has been decisive, or at least extremely important in addressing this crisis. And I guess that dimension would also need serious reflection. That is, one thing that has struck me here in Italy is the high potential for tensions between different levels of government, and also at the same time the very different track record performance of different regions. Like if you take Lombardia, which is still the hardest hit and still has the most contagions even today, and then next door there's Veneto, where they handled it much better. And so that says something about also about proximity as a very important part of any form of government and governance, that needs to be in a way rethought, or at least paid a lot of attention to, I feel. And COVID shows this. It's not just that we definitely, and I agree there with both Cassandra and Joelle, but we need to think about the global and the regional in a more transnational sense, but definitely also about lower levels of governments that have played a crucial role, of course. One of the dramas in the case of Lombardia is the way public healthcare has been just completely destroyed, to put it bluntly, by both corruption and forms of privatization. So, well, that's just something I think we should add to the mix in terms of thinking about the future.
Just to echo Paul completely, one of the really interesting aspects when we talk about the complexity of, say, authoritarian responses, or more sincerely, engagement with whether or not the COVID-19 crisis was real, so tapping into that fake news element, is in large states in the US and in Brazil, it's been, and I saw Cassie nodding along to this, it's been regional and local governments that have taken the lead. You're seeing this very divergent approaches between central federal government, which, with the exception of the US and Australia, typically powers are centralized in terms of emergencies at federal level for coordination purposes. But you're seeing this reliance on regional and local government when best strategy says localize your response, but have a coordinated national policy. So there's heroic things being seen throughout the world, but not necessarily a coordinated national level. To pick up very briefly on the two questions, one of the prime concerns in the context of emergency is emergency propagates emergency. State powers or executive powers that have little or no oversight, I mean, that's very tempting. It's great not to have to justify your behavior to anyone or anything. It's a fantastic way of introducing policy. But critically, what we see is state powers that can take advantage of an emergency, for example, permanently changing the law. This is why, exactly as Andrea said, the aspect of sunset clauses, of limitations. So we've seen Hungary permanently changing the law in 2015. We've seen them permanently changing the law in 2020. I don't want to say that we would get to the concern of, say, Egypt, which had nearly a constant state of emergency since, I think, 1967, then reforms the constitution in 2014, only to re-enter a constant state of emergency since 2017. I doubt that we'll get to that level in the EU, but critically, we do need to think of how to reform the laws. One of the concerns from my perspective in terms of the overuse of ordinary legislation is this is a state in emergency without a state of emergency. It avoids a lot of the critical oversight and scrutiny mechanisms that we would expect to see in the law. Going forward from a legal perspective, again, there are just clear universal principles. It's legal certainty, it's transparency, it's urgency of action, and it's oversight. These are clear universal principles. But again, this is whether or not we'll have in time and space. As a final point on just reform in the EU context, as I realize I'm going on a bit long, what I think is going to be determinative of the future is not essentially state action, it's going to be recovery at international level. So while we've seen nationalism in response, I think internationalism in recovery is going to be determinative. And this is exactly what Andrea is picking up on in terms of solidarity at EU level being determinative of recovery and speed of recovery. Again, living in a state right now that's been in near constant legal crisis with Brexit and now compounding it with COVID, it's very familiar to go from emergency to emergency and have that crisis reaction constantly. But recovery is going to be international. Recovery is going to be coordinated. At least, I hope.
Thank you so much for that. And I think it kind of, I guess it, as Andrea was mentioning before, I think these are all points that will kind of strengthen the argument that we're trying to make, right? That if COVID-19 is to be kind of a catalyst for change, aside from a justification for emergency measures, then these are the kinds of issues and questions we should be looking at. The question is, whether we are going in that direction or not, I guess it's still rather open. Perhaps we have a couple of, if you have time still to stay with us, we have a couple of final questions before we bring this to a close. A very specific question asked for to Joelle and Cassandra with regards to how several states reacted to COVID-19 without officially declaring a state of emergency, even though the measures introduced did not differ significantly from the more kind of extreme cases that we've seen. So would you define these kind of de facto derogations? Would you agree with this remark from Teresa Moeth? And then we have a reflection from Martin Postacek on how, in fact, and this goes in the direction of what Paul mentioned before, of the positive impact of kind of COVID-19 on civil society, in the sense of how it kind of jump-started and kind of strengthened a reaction that we may not have expected, but that in fact was significant. And whether you again agree with that observation. I guess we can go with these two questions as we're running out of time. We can't hear you.
I said the most insightful things I've said all week in the last 30 seconds. So unfortunately, I won't be able to repeat it. But just as I'm going to throw derogations and engagement with rights debates over to Cassie, I can give a very brief, some brief comments on the use of ordinary legislation. Preface this by saying, relying on a state of emergency or relying on ordinary legislation, it does not make it more or less likely that the state is using or misusing power. There's no strong correlation either way. That's something very important to note first. But critically, in the use of ordinary legislation, usually the reasons for relying on ordinary legislation are very much in the national context. For example, the constitutions do not allow for use of emergency powers in the context of a health emergency. I think I could count the number of states on one hand that constitutionally or in terms of their emergency laws mention epidemic, mention health emergency. So they just cannot. Otherwise, in many states, they've simply recognized that the ordinary powers are sufficient or they can be worked around. But when you rely on ordinary legislation, and especially when you rely on ordinary legislation, but don't rely on ordinary mechanisms of scrutiny and time and oversight and external engagement, this creates critical issues in terms of not talking about rights, especially when rights are being impacted on. The question of derogation and obligation to derogate, I'm going to throw over to my wonderful friend and colleague, Cassandra.
Great. Thanks for that setup, Joelle. So I don't remember if I clearly stated or not. So if a state does not declare a state of emergency for dealing with COVID for any of the reasons that Joelle just mentioned, they're still able to restrict a certain set of rights without saying this is a state of emergency or without notifying the organizations that they're derogating, right? So they're allowed to restrict the practice of one's religion, the respect for private and family life, which that's in the ECHR, and I've been sitting with that one for a while. Like, what exactly respect for private and family life can you do under that? I don't know. But then freedom of movement, assembly, association, and expression, you're able to restrict them to whatever degree you deem necessary in the face of a public health emergency. So I think even the states that maybe don't have it in their constitution to declare a state of emergency can turn to this and as signatories of any of these treaties and say, you know, we're going to restrict, but there's no check, unlike the formal derogations under Article 15, for instance, of the European Convention. So it's actually much less strict on the governments. We can, theorize why that might be, right? And maybe this is going back to one of the previous questions, like, oh, something we need to think about changing. But for now, yeah, if you're working just with the ordinary legislation within your country, you can still do these restrictions legally. You're muted.
Would you now, Paul, would you like to elaborate a little on the role of civil society, as I mentioned earlier?
Well, I would particularly like to react to Martin Potůček's remark, who's our colleague and is a prominent member of the RECONNECT project, about a positive set of outcomes. I do share this view that particularly on the EU level, and I think Andrea corroborated a bit this reading of events. There seems to be a moving into towards a direction that I think is indeed extremely necessary. That is combining a monetary union with a serious economic union, which has been, I think, the biggest mistake of the whole Euro project from the start, to not do that. But my concern is, and I'm not sure if I'm fully updated here, but as far as I know, until recently at least, the public opinion in Italy, for instance, has been dramatically anti-EU, and even more than it has already been in the last years. And of course, the trick is perhaps exactly as Joelle and I think Cassandra mentioned as well, in how to communicate this, how to make sure that these changes that we perceive at the EU level actually arrive also at larger parts of the population. And that also reminds me of another aspect that I think is important. That is, some events have been postponed, like the so-called conference on the future of Europe, introduced by the von der Leyen Commission, which should have been starting on the 9th of May, and which promises an enormous amount of civic participation, etc. I mean, we still have that part of the story at play as well. That is the EU facing serious tensions and facing a serious lack of legitimacy in the eyes of many European citizens. And yeah, I'm always good at ending on a dark note. I'm sorry for that. But let's hope indeed that we managed. We might help as a project as well to spread a different view of, in this case, of the European project.
Very much so, very much so. So thank you for that. Perhaps a last word a very brief last word from Andrea on what you see should kind of come into place, both in terms of public opinion, both in terms of kind of the political willingness and readiness for kind of a more concrete approach to solidarity, as you've outlined in your presentation. And do you think that part of the answer is also having a proposal as the one that you made that is kind of able to find the right balance, as it were, in dealing with this rather complex principle?
Yeah, I just want to say, yeah, I agree very much with what Paul said. But I do wonder, even in the Italian case, with respect, yes, it's true that very recently Italy has really flipped. It used to be the most Europhilic, the Euro-loving Europe in Europe, and then now it's become extremely skeptical. But I think that can change quite quickly, given Italy's relationship to Europe, but only if Europe is perceived again as a way of moving forward rather than a kind of cage in which Italian government, Italian publics feel they're locked in. So that's all to be seen. But with respect to the future, I do think that COVID has offered this opportunity to establish some kind, as I said before, some kind of fiscal capacity at the European level. And once people see if it works, that it does work, and that it's not so bad, you know, oh wow, the European level can raise these funds independently through, you know, loans on markets. He's able to raise them and then to disperse them in a good way. And look, it made a difference. Then that will make people more likely to then think, well, maybe we can extend this in the future. And I think that's what a lot of people are thinking. So, so I guess that's my hopeful conclusion. Maybe too hopeful, maybe naive, but.
Wonderful. Thank you everyone. That's really all the time that we have for today. So I would really like to thank our great panel for the great discussion, and of course our audience and those of the audience that are still with us. Our next webinar will be on the 25th of June on EU law and populist times, so please stay tuned for our updates on that. And from all of us, it's goodbye and thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.